Thank you for that very kind introduction, and also for the opportunity to talk to you about what I think is possibly one of the most important things that exists for accountancy, finance, and for education. I do apologize to some people who are going to hear some things which I've been saying, I think, for the last 30 years, okay? But sometimes things are worth repeating. Sometimes you need to be persistent to try and kind of drive change. So I've tried to put some new stuff up, but there are some real, I suppose, simple, straightforward messages that are universal. And please do not think I am targeting Ireland for this criticism, so because it's something it's pretty much a global problem with local consequences. Also, everybody has to play their part in actually kind of driving a place. And I kind of this really challenge, I think, that the minister mentioned professional responsibilities of accountants. I think we have professional responsibilities as educators. We are privileged to have almost the kind of like the cream of the youth and some of the old and mature and people coming back. And we give an opportunity to work with them, to develop them, to get kind of like knowledge in it. And how many of us can actually say that we really optimize that opportunity, that we actually kind of take advantage of all these different things, and what are some of the constraints that we actually work? And this idea that how can we educate current and future accountants? Now, the current's important as well, because we actually think, we've got like the lovely 18-year-olds coming in, all spotty and all these sort of things, looking horribly youthful. But they're going to be working till they're about 68. But the other thing is there's people already in the system that actually have kind of been developed and trained, invested an awful lot of their time and the knowledge in doing things which we're now largely saying are inappropriate and wrong. I'm going to have to kind of to reskill. So I think it's a big challenge that we need to do, and we need to look at our individual part. But I'm going to start with a little story. Here's a conclusion. Start with a conclusion, right? Say that all the time. Here's the conclusion. Position paper, urgent timeline, achieving climate goal, must do things today. Help businesses and consumer, set a clear path to follow, targeted investment, reskilling, careful application of tax, strategic level, green finance, sustainability efforts, behavioral change, propel us towards the sustainable development goals. Now, to be honest, this is a good conclusion. This is one which has been written since about 1990. Right? And it's really important. But what is important is who said that. Anyone want to guess? Oh, chartered accountants. Not some hairy-assed ecologist who's kind of like, sort of like sitting there, sort of like, growing their own peat and sort of like eating sort of stuff like this. This is accountants. This is professional accountants actually kind of saying this. That this is kind of like critical. The message is the same, but who is saying it is different. It's now, if you like, being kind of mainstreamed. And this is important, I think, for educators and also for practitioners. Because the bodies which, if you like, are someone responsible for shaping and thought leadership and defining so many different things are actually saying this kind of like transformational message. The question for a lot of us is, are we living up to some of these claims that people are actually making? There's lots of other things going on here. I mean, just went on the website. Irish SMEs favour green investments. Despite cost benefits. Would you know that if you look at certain types of things? You've got Just Transition, National Accelerator. Again, not coming from an activist perspective, but actually coming from the mainstream. This is important to get this established. Then you go back over the last week. Climate change, CSRD, more than just compliance. I am so jealous you've got CSRD. Really, really am. Honestly, you've got a kind of a potential to transform the way in which we do accountability, right? People who are not going to kind of like be doing this type of work will be doing it in the future. They'll be catching up. Europe, the EU, has a massive leadership opportunity to capture this, to make a difference. Okay? This is moving. There's so many of the kind of the characteristics that as researchers we've been arguing for decades that need to be done. And the Green Deal and the CSRD is as close to initiating this in practice. And I know it's going to be difficult. I know it's going to be disruptive. But to be honest, what we've been doing before has been wrong. What we've been doing before has actually made the problem worse. What we've been doing before is almost a form of ecological and social self-harm. That we are kind of doing things. You just got to look at some of the things that are actually happening right now. We're sort of like, we're living in a kind of like a whole set of society and governance which is ignoring the evidence. Anyone who looks at what's happened in Valencia, you know, could you imagine? I was just thinking, imagine if a year's amount of rain from Ireland fell on the one day. How much would that be? But just think of that as a concept and look at what the disruption that 8 hours of weather can do to what we think is a resilient, robust. And Spain is a well-run, well-organized nation, okay, with lots of resources. Our kind of sense of our dependency and our vulnerability that we have to these different things is actually, it's really hard to fathom. And things like, you know, deforestation regulations. But again, you've got to look at it. It's not always about, you know, looking at regulation not as a constraint, but as an opportunity. I mean, Ireland's beef, you know, okay, we can argue about beef and climate and stuff like that, but you've got grass-fed beef. You've got all these other people that are getting these beasts, keeping them, you know, feeding them, pumping them full of kind of like all sorts of growth hormones and stuff like that. These are opportunities that you've actually got to do. So the first bit is really just to sort of like to say that the world is changing, okay? The pressures that we've got to respond to, what we've got to account for, the risks we've got to manage, the crisis, the existential crisis that are coming, the threats to business models, the risks are real, okay? And we need to look at kind of changing, and I think kind of changing urgently. But my provocation to you is that most accounting education is misaligned with sustainable transformation and public expectations. And arguably, we get the crisis that we account for, okay? And we have to step back and just say, well, let's look at the way we do it. We've had, you know, people, let's look at this. We've had centuries of experimentation with investment appraisal that ignores the climate consequences. That worked out well. We've had kind of like centuries of working out how to do accounting without taking into account labor exploitation of kind of minority groups, and basically slavery. That's worked out well as well, hasn't it? You know, we've actually got the evidence that shows by not accounting for it, things get worse, and we've got a lot of the problems. And arguably, we've got the world that we've accounted for. Just a little kind of test. There's a little thing that kind of often people do. If you don't believe me, look at any account. Look at your accounting reports. Look at your practices. Look at your assurance practices. Look at your courses. Look at your techniques. And try and answer these questions. The extent to which what you do, does it incorporate the full range of the Sustainable Development Goals? Does it properly account and measure the consequences of whatever it is you're doing to these different goals? The extent to which you kind of maybe mention them, but you only look at part of the problem. Or whether you misleadingly account for your representation of the consequences of what you do to these things. Or inaccurately, or you kind of miss them out altogether. Just only takes about 5 minutes. Just try it on your whatever it is you do, and looking to see where you can put. Oops, I've mucked things up. Sorry. These things here, because if you've not got the SDGs in the top line, you're taking a risk. you're not accounting for things properly. You're not accounting for consequences. You're fooling yourself. Unless it's in the top line, that's in the zones of ignorance, where you're actually deciding to make decisions, to account, to measure performance, without actually looking at the consequences on these sustainable development goals. And I don't know about you, but just like missing stuff out because it seems to be hard or I'm not used to doing it, doesn't seem like a very smart approach. So again, just this question. But again, at the core of this, I think, is that there's this kind of notion of reclaiming the purpose, the possibility, and the power of accounting to actually to do things differently and to measure things correctly, to get the better decisions, to inform people, to point people in the right direction, to look at what it is we do, moving away from this kind of technical side of things to look at what it is what is the power of accounting, to empower, to repurpose accounting to sustainability. Let's not miss out the things which are important. Now, when we come to look at education, when we come to look at research, and when we come to look at practice, there's at the start, we need to understand what organizations and communities and different accounting objects need to do to become more sustainable. So we need to understand what actions are actually required. It reminds me of my very first job as an accountant. I worked in the health service. They basically said, can you recost all of the lab tests, Ian, for the pathology lab? And I thought, yeah, that's dead for you. You're out of university, you're cocky, you can do anything, right? So I start off, get the accounts out, work out the existing costs, and I'm sitting there. And this kind of grizzly old accountant wanders past and says, what are you doing? I said, I'm recosting the stuff in the pathology lab. He says, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm recosting the stuff in the pathology lab. He says, do you know where the pathology lab is? I'm going, no. Do you know what they do in the pathology lab? Not really. Do you know what is it that they do well in a pathology lab? No. And he said, well, just get that out of here and get to the pathology lab and talk to the pathologists. Because unless you know what the kind of the underlying work and the activities are, how on earth can we account for things, right? And how many of us are quite confident, well, we'll recost something without actually knowing what it is that they're actually doing. So we need to understand what these things are, because often, if we don't know that, we can make recommendations and we can make advice that actually make things worse. And that's if you like, that's a major problem. And then the next stages we've got to do is what can accounting do to help organizations become more sustainable? So there's two phases of these different things. Because sometimes if you need both sides of these. And particularly what accounting can do is we can actually measure the consequences of things. We can actually do things if we do our accounting properly. And if we do it in some ways, prefiguratively, where we bring in the attributes of what we want to achieve within our evaluation, within our accounting system, we can then do the analysis first before we kind of experiment and damage things even further. We can at least identify the bad consequences, the negative consequences, the trade-offs, and look at ways in which we can redesign interventions. IFAC, again, this other revolutionary green organization, sort of like, go on their website. This is straight off their website, 8 practical ways accountants can make a difference. Okay, and that's been up for a while now. And again, you can see there's nothing really radical here, which makes you think is that we've not been doing this. Why have people not been doing this? Have we been training them to do them? Have we told them to do it? Have we exposed our students to the ways in which they can do this? And typically if we can make a difference. I'd argue off this big list of different things here, we're maybe driving efficiency by reducing waste and controlling cost, and maybe communicating clearly to ensure transparency. That's certainly one thing that CSRD is going to do, is actually kind of like make a difference in there. There's a lot of other ones there that I think we've got a kind of a plan of action there. And again, what I'm really sort of like trying to, sort of like over the work and working with lots of different other kind of educators, many of them who are in the room here, by the way, as well. So often you don't need people from outside to come and tell you. You should talk to people within your own community. This is, I thought this was really funny, right? So you've heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? Just let's decapitalize the UN and call it the Unsustainability Development Goals, right? And we're really good at that. If you were sort of like looking at our performance against these goals, you would say you've been incredibly successful. You've been brilliant at creating, 1 billion people going to bed hungry? You know, billions of people actually sort of in extreme poverty. Even in places like the UK, we've got 20% of the people, child poverty is there. We're really good at poverty. We're great at poor health. Even though if we've got loads of money, we still kind of like, you know, kill our population or diminish their quality of life in an incredibly effective way, right? Eco-destruction. 2/3 of tree species are sliding into extinction. 2/3 of trees that we rely on for so many kind of different things. We're good at conflict, very good at injustice, inequality, wars, and we can see the real consequences of these different things that are actually there. And you know, this is there. And what we really want to do is, this is the world today, and we want to get rid of the unsustainability development goals and seriously embrace the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And actually look at using these in a prefigurative way to sort of say, well, our accountability, if we have these goals, which we do have, we have all signed up for them, even with just recently the kind of the Pact for the Future, where we've sort of like countries other than Russia, Syria, Iran, North Korea. There's another couple of countries that have decided not to sign up for it. We've reaffirmed these things, these goals or stuff like that. Only 20% of these targets were on target for these things. But I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are a really good way to kind of like to critique and try and understand what it is we're not doing, okay? And to try and understand the things that we're doing but we're not doing well. And actually sort of like if we can actually look at these different things. And if you look at these, you know, if people go, oh, UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're not great. I go, well, tell me one that you wouldn't change. Anytime we have this discussion, we end up with another 5 or 6, right? Anytime you go, it's too complicated. You've got 17, it's too complicated. You go, let's have a proper discussion over what they should actually be. You'll add more, okay? So this is just a starting point of the kind of like the vision of it. And it's actually, it's workable. It's had remarkable kind of traction. People go, well, we're not achieving the goals, so should we give them up? Duh. Right? There's this argument, oh, we're not achieving them, so let's just throw them away. Well, why would you do that? Why would you not just go, we're obviously doing something wrong. Let's change what we're doing wrong, not change the goals. I mean, one way to think about this from an accounting perspective, this is quite a kind of a useful exercise, is actually to think about these things as a currency. Right? You know, so we've got our transactions, and we're quite happy to shift from euros to pounds to dollars to yens. We quite often will look at things in terms of time and physical amounts of resources. Why don't we think of things in terms of their carbon emissions, their water emissions, their impact on poverty, their impact on hunger? And think of these as currencies to analyze the same kind of like transactions and get this different perspective. And we can then start to see the consequences and how an individual transaction or an asset or a liability or something that we do, we can actually start to build. And we can build in these things. And most of them, it doesn't take long to come up with starting to get reasonable proxies that are just as accurate as the kind of the proxies and the measurement and the valuations we do for financial accounting. Okay? We also put a false standard or quality on things like carbon accounting, yet we're quite happy to make so many kind of like broad brush guesses and stuff like that in relation to financial transactions, financial values. You can't get that, sir. Not, that carbon footprint isn't right. And you're going, yeah, because the value of an asset in a balance sheet's right, isn't it? There's no doubt about that. Everyone agrees that that's it there. So again, these things, and just an exercise is start to pick some of them as currencies and start to add in different currencies into our transactions. And start to bring in some of the contemporary issues that are actually going on just now. I mean, and again, sort of like making this real. And when we're doing any kind of lectures or any type of engagement, do this. And I often will just let's look at the papers. Let's flip up the headlines of the papers and see how quickly we can actually get into sustainability kind of like crisis. Things to do with flooding, wildfires. I mean, we've got wildfires and floods happening at the same time in the same places. Joan couldn't even get, where was it you were able to go when you were in Portugal, Joan? You were stuck in Porto because there was wildfires there. You sort of like had to close down the motorway, close down the stuff. These are, these are real things. Think of the disruption to supply chains. I think the first time that Toyota's supply chain went was because of weather-related stuff hitting the Middle East, disrupted their whole kind of like model. We've got child labor in a lot of the minerals that we've actually got. We've not just got blood diamonds, we've got blood coal, we've got blood cadmium, we've got blood, everything that's actually sort of going on. Stuff that you depend. If you think you're okay, just put your hands on your phone, pick it up. There will be misery in that phone. There will be misery in that phone. That's okay. Put it back in. Okay. Now, these are things that we can start to expose. Gender pay gap. Don't even begin. I mean, it's a misleading statement. No, it's not a misleading statement or measurement. It's the fact that we're kind of like systematically discriminating against over 50% of the population. It's not it's not a kind of like you're measuring it wrong. Because you can measure it kind of like differently. No, you just shouldn't be doing it in the first place. You shouldn't, these stuff there. Different nature. Things that are happening in the real world, and we look at our textbooks. You accuse Susan up for later on, but look at our textbooks. Where we've got stuff which, widgets. Widgets. A widget has so many minutes and hours and stuff like that. There's a tutorial there, van drivers moving in and out. Should we organize routes, activity-based costing type stuff? Why don't we just kind of add in a little bit and go, actually in Manchester, they've got a low emission zone. They're going to charge stuff. They're going to ban diesel lorries going in over a certain size. What's the consequence of that? How is that not accounting? How is that not looking at the value of your diesel vans, which no longer can be used? They're effectively a form of stranded asset that we've still got there, and then we've got alternatives in place, and we can actually start to put these in. Anybody who's doing stuff in materiality that's not mentioned in double materiality, have a look at yourself, right? Because that's the reality. That's not kind of made up stuff. That's the practice. We're lagging behind practice. Right? Research is often lagging behind practice in this space. There's lots of materials out there that you can actually use. There's lots of people who are willing to talk about. You even got a minister to talk to accountants. I mean, for goodness sake, well done. Banks, insurance companies. Insurance companies are wetting themselves over this, by the way. I had a really kind of interesting chat with some Swedish insurance people. Whoa, are they worried? Are they worried? Because their whole basic business model is kind of potentially screwed. And they were a mutual organization. And their whole premise was that they had cheap, affordable kind of like insurance because it came from a union movement for communities. They're now looking at it and they're sort of going, we now really can't insure anybody. And they're having real moral dilemmas over what do we do? What do we do? Because they know with stuff like this, stuff that's affecting Sweden and Finland, and even sort of like small minor things, are changing the whole earth upon which their towns are actually kind of lived on. There's lots of material out there. Don't think that there's not. Just have a look for it. This is a project I'm working with the Stockholm Resilience Centre and called FinBio, trying to redefine finance for transformational, regenerative nature investments. There's amazing sort of like information in there that they're actually kind of like working for. So have a look at this sort of stuff, get it in there. If you're using case studies, at least change some of them into kind of like business case studies. You know, you've got a really complicated one, which I did, which is maybe a bit academic, but then we've got stuff like Salesforce. They're really a kind of, you know, sort of again, another radical organization. They're looking at their kind of carbon footprint, how they're actually doing things. You've got Nike, you've got Puma, you've got high-profile businesses that you can do it. And don't worry too much about the greenwashing, because as soon as you get the students to look at it, they see right through it, right? And if you don't say, look, this is perfect, just go, here's what's actually sort of going on. You know, and teach kids how to do, teach our students how to do things like spot greenwashing. You can do an hour of greenwashing and then just give them any report and they will kind of like rip through it and they'll find out things that you didn't even see in that bit there. So it's not just about using case studies that you think are great, but actually they're saying we think we're great, but then you can critically evaluate. But it changes the narrative. I think the more we can expose in our education things which people are trying to make a difference rather than just doing the same old, we've got a kind of a chance to actually to do things. But we do need to critically evaluate them. We do need to have the professional skepticism in there and train people to actually do this. There's lots of really good little business games, simulations, again, you can use. You can throw in there. These first two, Fishery and Clean Start, they come from the radically left-wing organization called MIT Sloan Business School, which have got a whole bank of these things there. They've got some really interesting one. There's a nice one, Net Zero, on trying to do running hotels in different countries and stuff like that. I really like carbon footprint calculators. These are really good fun because they're really quick to use. You can integrate them into there. You can do it in a lecture or tutorial, and you just say, right, you're going to go from there to there. You're going to build something. You're going to do it. Do the carbon footprint. How much did it cost you to get here in terms of carbon? Bunch of things in, get the numbers, have the discussion. Get some kind of benchmarks about, yeah, look at you, this is really good, but you're using 5 times more carbon than somebody in Rwanda or in Kenya or stuff like that. Does that seem fair? So these things are really good at kind of exposing things. You can do something a little bit more radical. This is one which colleagues at Birmingham did, and we were looking at trying to do a role play with our students. And we used a professional actor, professional director to come up with this role play, because whatever we think, some of you maybe do amateur dramatics or stuff like this, but most of us, we're not really trained in the dramatic arts, okay? We maybe enjoy them, but are we kind of good at this? And we were thinking, so we were chatting, and he just said, okay, they look for the dramatic turn in a role play, right? And Nick kind of turned around and said, who ordered the concrete? And so what we do is we have a 2-part play with this role play. Part 1, we get the students all sitting around talking, negotiating about how much is it going to cost for the concrete for something that you're building in there. They don't necessarily know because they're not experts. They're sitting there and they go like, try and they suddenly start trying to get the price down and the standard, and they've got 3 or 4 different. Then they change around, they become the engineer, they become the procurement person, they become the health and safety, they become the accountant. And normally they come round and they go, hey, we managed to save 10%. We managed to save some money on this one, isn't it great? Part 2, you're now having to stand on the doorstep and say, oh, I'd just like to explain why we decided to not go for the highest quality concrete on the wellhead that actually has caused the biggest oil spill and one of the biggest kind of like ecological disasters there. 2 levels of accountability. One is the one that we teach them how to drive down costs, to make some bits of things, maybe to cut corners. And then the other one is like, well, here's what happens when you do this. Here's the consequence. How do you then justify it? And they stop from role-playing there, they start role-playing to the person, their spouse, their children, like as they're having to go up and face the consequences of the decision that they made. You can do something different. So again, we're moving up in things there. Now, at Birmingham, we mainstreamed carbon accounting across the whole syllabus. We created what we call a vertically integrated syllabus in relation to climate change. And we looked at every single course that we actually did, and then we looked at the relationship that is there. And then we included in each one at least one lecture, at least one tutorial, at least one piece of assessment. So when we looked at assurance, we looked at assurance for greenhouse gas emissions. We looked at risks of kind of like climate change. When we looked at asset valuation, we looked at stranded assets. We looked at different kind of like things like that. When we looked at management accounting, we looked at how you would kind of like value in some of the different costs, how you would look at some of the different benefits. We looked at it in a critical theoretical perspective as well. So we didn't just say climate accounting is necessarily good. Under what conditions is it good, and what are some of the other positives? So each one of our courses, we took the natural kind of like link between that material and there, and we actually created a kind of syllabus so that across there, and we didn't get duplication, we didn't always kind of do the thing. We looked at regulations, corporate governance, all these different things in relation to climate change. And it was easy. It was surprisingly easy to actually do. You just need a structure to do it. And what was really quite joyful for me, because I was kind of behind it, but, you know, sort of like trying to get everyone involved. When it came to the open days, when it came to the stuff that we're doing it, this is what they did to sell it to the students. Not the jobs, not the accreditation, they did it, and it was remarkably successful to do that. Maybe a little bit more radical, I'm working on a research project now which deals with trying to combat global malnutrition. We've got a world where we've got more than enough food that we grow. We have starvation, and we've got undernutrition and overnutrition, and at least a third of the food that we grow rots. It doesn't actually get consumed. That is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gases. It's one of the biggest sources of biodiversity destruction, because we're growing, so we're killing off nature to grow stuff that we let to rot. And people are starving. And this is a really interesting project because we know how to solve this, but we're not getting any money involved in it. And actually, with the project, it's not just a technological problem, it's not just an ecological problem, it's an accounting problem, because we're not actually able to do it. And what I've started to do is actually use this as not just as a teaching mechanism, but as a kind of a collaborative co-production stuff with students. So I've got a course which I run, design and management accounting systems. We're doing this, the students are working on this. We've got students in other things, we've got masters, we've got projects, we've got dissertations working on, but this is a big systemic problem. And you give the challenge, if we start to understand the challenge in these projects, we can actually start to really activate the learning, activate the knowledge, and activate the passion. And again, beware of false accreditation consciousness, right? Why are we not doing this? Oh, accreditation requirements. Okay, that's why I started off with what the Chartered Accounts. And I tell you, you talk to the professional accountancy bodies, they go, no, we want people to do this. John, we had this stuff with the QA benchmark, where we had big 4 firms, we had all the accountancy bodies, and they were just kind of going, it's not about accreditation. Please do not think it's about accreditation. It's about kind of training people, you know, professional skepticism to understand these different things. There is a responsibility, I think, for some of the professional accountancy bodies and stuff to be a little bit more clearer on this and say, oh, by the way, this is what we need. But often when people talk about accreditation, there's sort of like, in some ways, we're often forced to teach some things which are totally irrelevant to what's actually sort of going on, because people are now. And I know kind of like the Irish Institute has actually kind of changed that. And I think they've scooped out about 20% of the syllabus. Have you scooped out 20% of your syllabus? This is a reality. You know, you've got the CS, all these initials and stuff like that. This is real. This is practice. I wish we were doing this, right? I wish we will be teaching this anyway, because we know that this is what needs to do. This is not when I started off, it was a group of people who had some ideas about how things can actually change. Over the 30 years, the biggest change I've seen is actually it's moving from the minds of some foresighted thing. There was a special issue of IAASA Journal in 1991, 1 year before the Rio Declaration. You go back in there, and it's telling you to do stuff like this. It's warning against some of the things and saying, actually, make sure you do it properly. But these are things that we've actually got to do. We've got the whole process. These are practices. These are not theory. This is not theory. This is reality. This is practice. These are things that we really need to start to kind of like to do these different things. On human rights. Okay, there's procedures, there's protocols, there's assurance statements, there's measurement practices, there's a whole body of stuff out there which we seem blind to and we're not integrating into our syllabus, which I think is problematic. And I think that, you know, we're in a situation now where we've got a sustainability accounting crisis. You are fortunate because you have a pathway out of it that actually is not perfect, but it's moving in the right direction. At a time when we've got polycrisis and polyconflicts, a polycrisis, this idea we've got global risk combining, we've got reverse synergy going on, we've got things happening that are making things kind of collectively worse and worse. And this idea of global systems entangled that degrade the future of humanity. And they've got confusion and suffering because problems happen at the same time. As accountants, we can't solve all of those crises, but we can deal with what we can deal with. We can do what we do. We do what we've got control over. We do what we have professional responsibility for. We do what we have power and agency to do that we're maybe choosing not to. So, what are you going to do about that? And I'll stop now for questions.